Dan and Amy, yesterday at the Dalton, Georgia rally, Mike Pence spoke before President Trump spoke, and obviously the focus was on the two Senate races up today, but there was time to talk a little bit about Wednesday as well, and Pence had this to say.
You know, I know we all got our doubts about the last election, and I want to assure you, I share the concerns of millions of Americans about voting irregularities. And I promise you, come this Wednesday, we'll have our day in Congress. We'll hear the objections. We'll hear the evidence. But tomorrow is Georgia's day.
And President Trump built upon that to sort of make a reference to his vice president.
And I hope Mike Pence comes through for us. I hope that our great vice president comes through for us. He's a great guy. Of course, if he doesn't come through, I won't like him quite as much. No, Mike is a great guy. He's a wonderful man and a smart man and a man that I like a lot. But you're going to get straight shots. He's going to call it straight.
Well, if he calls it straight, then he's going to serve largely in a ceremonial role of counting the electors or presiding over the counting of the electors that have been submitted by the 50 states. So I don't know what the president's expectation is. He didn't really develop that. So we'll have to see. Josh Hawley, the first Republican senator to announce publicly that he would be lodging an objection tomorrow, was on with our friend Brett Baer yesterday, and he sort of articulated the same thing he did on Fox last week about the responsibility he feels he owes his constituents to provide voice for their concerns, much like Mike Pence was referencing. And Brett Baer pressed him if he doesn't also owe his constituents some honesty about what's going to happen on January 20th in terms of the next president of the United States.
That we have a vote of certification and that we have the opportunity to debate the results, to certify the results. We count them and then we certify. And my point is, this is my only opportunity during this process to raise an objection and to be heard. I don't have standing to file lawsuits. I'm not a prosecutor anymore. I used to be, but I'm not anymore. I can't investigate claims of voter fraud on my own, but I do have a responsibility in this joint session of Congress to either say I've got no problem with it or I do have a problem with it. And my constituents expect me and they're right to say I have a problem.
Constituents? Don't you have a responsibility to tell them that it's not going to be President Trump as of January 21st as well?
Well, Brett, I'm trying to do something more than just that. I mean, this is about the integrity of our elections. And this is about taking a stand where you can take a stand. I mean, I suppose you can just say, well, listen, nothing I do will matter. It won't matter if I object or not, so I'll just sit by and do nothing. I mean, that's one approach, but I can tell you that the people of my state, they won't understand that and they shouldn't. They say you have the opportunity to stand up and be heard and to object. You have the opportunity to try and force change, and you should, and that's what.
For more on this, we're pleased to be joined again by Andy McCarthy, former Chief Assistant U.S. Attorney in Manhattan, contributing editor at National Review, author of the bestseller, Ball of Collusion, The Plot to Rig an Election and Destroy a Presidency. Andy, thanks for joining us again. Appreciate it.
My pleasure. Good morning.
Good morning. I've read your commentary on the topic, so I have a pretty good idea where you're coming from. And you suggest, and you particularly focus in on Cruz and Hawley because they're both fairly respected originalist officers of the court. And you suggest that what they're doing is improper. It shouldn't be done.
Yeah, well, it is improper, and they know it's improper. Well, let me, especially after you played what you just played, the session that Hawley had where he really wouldn't answer Brett Baer's pointed question. I've really come around to the idea, Dan, that this is it's not just a cynical exercise in trying to appeal to Trump's base. I think that the Electoral Commission is a con job. And that is, if you notice when Hawley was answering or not answering Baer's questions, he wouldn't say what he was going to object to. just kept saying, I'm going to object. This is my only opportunity to stand up and object. But notice what he didn't say, which is what Wednesday is about. He didn't say, I'm going to object to Pennsylvania's votes. I'm going to object to Wisconsin's votes. And I think what these guys have done is they don't want to be in a position of making the Republican Party against the enfranchisement, or having the Republican Party disenfranchise the voters in states that Republicans are going to need in the future to win elections if they ever want to win the presidency again. That's not a position they want to be in. So I think they've come up with this Electoral Commission as something that they know will lose, but that they can call for, and that will be their objection. So
I agree.
Way,
yeah,
look, maybe what will happen is they won't object to any particular state, which will mean, if that happens, that'll mean the House, they can make as much noise as they want. If they don't get a senator who goes along with them, then no state's votes are going to be objected to, and they'll just pretend that this Electoral Commission is the be all and end all of their objection. And of course, that thing's going to go down in flames because it's not going to have enough votes, and then we'll all be able to get on with our lives. I can hope at least that that's what is going on.
Well, let me respond in two ways to that. One is, I agree that they're doing this recognizing that it's not going to happen, that they're doing this as a way to put a marker down. Now, in the conversation that Holly had with Baer and McCallum, they did talk about Pennsylvania specifically, and Pennsylvania Supreme Court's action and inaction specifically. So that may be part of it. Now, remember, Hawley is not part of the Election Commission, just to restate there. That's
right.
Cruz and 11 others. Hawley really focused on, so he sort of talked generally about election irregularities, and then he focused, and I think this will be the thrust of probably his comments, since this is the thrust of his rise to prominence, focusing on social media, the big tech companies. But as you know, with 2 hours to debate each of the states that are raised, and you have to raise them in writing, specific states, that there are going to be some senators and members of the House that are in safe districts or safe states, as the case may be, that will go specifically after Pennsylvania, and the Pennsylvania Supreme Court will go after the indefinitely confined designees in Wisconsin and some of the other states. And it is interesting to note that among those, and I noted this yesterday, among those Republican senators who've signed on to object, Ron Johnson seems to be the only one in a state that is really, up for grabs, where he is really taking a political risk in signing on to this.
Yeah, look, I want to be clear. All the things that you just went through, there are a number of aspects of Pennsylvania's election that are objectionable, not least the illegal extension of the 3 days on Election Day. There's probably 3 or 4 that we could go through, but that's the main one that's been before the Supreme Court since October, and the court won't act on it. I wrote a column that kind of analyzed what the state Supreme Court in Wisconsin did, and came to the conclusion that at least one big category of the votes they were talking about, which is these democracy in the park events, where they didn't actually give ballots to state election officials, which is what state law requires. I think those 17,000 votes should have been thrown out, but that doesn't mean they were 17,000 votes for Biden. And
right.
Even if they were 3-1 or 4-1 for Biden, it's still not enough to get over the, to get over the 22,000 or whatever it is that he lost by. So what I'm saying is there's a number of things to object to, and while I've tried to be realistic about how this is coming out, I've tried to point out what I think each one of them is. But here's the thing that you also, if you're going to be persnickety about that, and I have been, and I can understand why others should be, because this is an important issue going forward, regardless of what happens with Trump. But the other thing, if you're going to follow the law, then you got to follow the law. Under Section 5 of the federal election law, if the states certify by 6 days before the electoral votes are counted, as a matter of federal law, that is dispositive. So they don't, it says in federal law that, if this is resolved at the state level, because under the Constitution, the states are sovereign when it comes to picking the president. It's not even the people, it's the states. If the states have resolved this, Josh Hawley has to respect that because he's a federal official, and federal law says that we respect the state certification at that point. So should we object to these things? Should we address them for future purposes? Absolutely. And if they were to have an electoral commission, not for the purpose of delegitimizing the current election, but for curing the problems going forward, and even though I've always been someone who's been opposed to this, imposing some federal rules on what states are allowed to do and not allowed to do if we're going to go down this crazy path of doing mail-in voting, fine. I think that's all to the good to do that. But I just think if this thing is going to be a debacle about delegitimizing the election we had, where people like Josh Hawley, a Supreme Court clerk who graduated from Yale Law School and well knows he can read a statute just like I can, under federal law, what has already happened is dispositive. And his role on Wednesday is to watch the votes get counted.
Although the Election Count Act of 1887 does provide an opportunity to object, right?
It's the law says. I happen to think this part of the law is unconstitutional, but the law does say.
But the law is the law at present.
Well, okay, but then I don't ever want to hear if everybody wants to take that position, fine, but then don't come back and tell me that you're really offended that the deep state and the swamp wants to federalize our elections, because that's precisely what you're doing. If you're taking the position that Congress can second states on their elections to dispose of their electoral votes, that's a long-time Democratic position. So let's not pretend that, we're all, limited government conservatives, because we're not.
Well, then why are Hawley and Cruz doing this? I mean, they're smart people. As you mentioned, they're both former Supreme Court clerks, but what's the motive? If they know
they want to run for president, they want to appeal to the Trump. There's 75 million people voted for Trump, or 74 million, whatever it is. That's a pretty good start for an election campaign. If you can, if you can get his core part of that. I don't know. Look, I consider myself a kind of traditional National Review type conservative who voted more against Biden than for Trump, although I think Trump did a lot of good things policy-wise. But of that 75 million people, somewhere between 25 and 45 are pretty hardcore Trump people. And if you could command that base, that is, command the loyalty of that base, that's a pretty good start to an election campaign.
Yeah, there's no question. And something you said, look, I think you make an important point, not just about the safe harbor provision in federal law, but about, let's remember way back 4 weeks ago, right? When we were way back, 5 lifetimes ago, 4 weeks ago, before December 8th and before December 14th, and we talked about in this show, you're on clocks here because we were talking about all the litigation that was being filed. We were assessing the legal strategy and so forth. You're on a December 8th clock. We talked about this with you. We're on a December 8th clock. We're on a December 14th clock. And as you go through that process, your options winnow. And so that's exactly what's happened. And I think, and I know you understand this, but I want to give voice to it because I don't want to be dismissive of the exasperation the way that some are, not talking about you, which is to say, right, we have these arenas for dispute resolution. And you know what? They failed us. That's what people are saying. They failed us. The Pennsylvania Supreme Court failed us, and then the United States Supreme Court failed us. And we've had, and maybe the Trump legal team failed us too, but they raised real issues that should have been investigated further, so we got substantive answers to some of the concerns or some of the irregularities, some of the wild statistical anomalies, and we're left unsatisfied because we don't have good answers there, and there's probably blame to spread around at least some of, if not all of, and more, the categories I mentioned. And I just and I find the whole thing unsatisfying. And so I'm sort of the position, knowing that the Democrats are ends justify the means types, that we should start playing by their rules, which is to say no rules, to try to get some justice here.
Well, let me just say about that, because I think there's a lot of force to what you just said. But the problem with this whole escapade since November 3rd has been that we look at the election as if the election was the only thing going on, and because it's a complex problem. The only way you can deal with complex problems is to kind of sort of focus in on them at the expense of everything else. But life doesn't work that way. There's a number of different interests involved, and one of the important interests is you have to have a president who's up and running and ready to go on January 20th, which requires some preparation. And it used to be the law in our country until the Constitution was changed that the president didn't get inaugurated until, was it March? I forget.
March.
If it was March 20th or March 4th, but it was March, right? So if you had that system again, you would be able to focus more. You'd have more time, and you'd be able to focus more on the election. You wouldn't be trying to prove fraud on a compressed time frame, which is a very, very difficult thing to do unless there's some screaming evidence of fraud. But the reason that the Constitution got changed is we found that was a terrible way to run the government, to have a lame duck president for, 6 months or whatever it was, and that was the reason it got moved back. And the reason I bring that up is there simply is no perfect solution here. We can decide after this experience that we need to focus like a laser beam on nothing but the election. And what we'll be doing is disserving the preparation for the next president to be up and running and ready to go at noon on Inauguration Day. And I just think it's very easy to miss that now because this has been so controversial. But the fact is there are other concerns here. And the most important concern for the United States is that somebody is ready to be president at noon on January 20th.
He is Andy McCarthy, former Chief Assistant U.S. Attorney in Manhattan, contributing editor, National Review, author of the bestseller Ball of Collusion, The Plot to Rig an Election and Destroy a Presidency. Andy, always appreciate your time. Thank you.
You guys have a great day. Thanks.
Thank you. And he joined us on our turnkey.pro answer line.